Anna Porter and I go back a long way. 1968, I was a brand new fledgling producer installed at the CBC and preparing to assemble my first staff, and some, I think it was central mechanism of what was then called personnel, asked me to interview a number of candidates. And Anna Porter turned up, but before she was Porter. And needless to say, she was an intellectual and technical knockout, and I was smitten, but professionally, just professionally, and determined I would hire her. But that process, when I was new to it, insisted that I had to meet the other candidates. And by the time that machine got around to rolling to actually making an offer, Anna had fled the country and gone off on some travels, and eventually got sick, I think it was, and ended up going back to New Zealand, where she had grown up and had some family. So, missed opportunity. And then I don't know if it was almost 10 years later, she was now installed back, oh, here we are, at a job in publishing in Canada, and had begun her inexorable climb to the very heights of the literati and the glitterati. She found herself between jobs, and says in her memoir here that she briefly considered reaching out to me and seeing if there was something available for her at City TV, which I had in the interim started. But no sooner was she seized of this thought than she put it aside, because she said she'd heard that I was grumpy. Yeah, it's right here in the book. I'm trying to find the reference. 213, not only grumpy, but combative. Combative. Anna Porter. Oh, yes, yes. When she was here last in 2002, which was 17 years ago. I'm glad I remembered this, yeah. She gave a talk, and some parts of it were predictable. She talked about publishing in general, Canadian publishing, cultural nationalism, that kind of thing. And then, to my surprise, and I think to the surprise of many people in the audience, right at the very end, she said this.
I've been worrying about anti-Semitism. And I just want to, you know, all of us in this room, I'm sure, have heard slurs, anti-Semitic slurs. And wherever it is you live, I mean, you hear them. And in the beginning, you kind of, the first little bit, you kind of perhaps pretend you didn't hear it. And you walk on. I think it's really gotten a lot worse in the past year. It's gotten, and it's almost as if people who are anti-Semitic feel that their anti-Semitism is sanctioned by what's been happening in the Middle East, and it isn't sanctioned. And I was actually demonstrating in front of the French consulate just a little while ago on behalf of solidarity with Jews at risk. And I think if you look at the newspapers, I mean, in Canada alone, there have been over 200 actual violent acts against Jews in the past 6 months. I find that terrifying. I find the thought that stupid fiasco of a book has been reissued and is the Protocols of Zion or whatever. It's stupid. It's about a 1900 czarist fabrication. It's being reissued and it's being touted as real. I find this incredibly disturbing. And Here's his name, José Saramago. I was reading something he wrote. He's a Nobel Prize-winning novelist, and he wrote something about Jews recently, and he's comparing, he's saying, you know, David and Goliath, he's turned the whole thing around, where David is really the bad guy because he is the small, smart guy, whereas Goliath is kind of dark, and he is the victim in this version of that old story.
Conference, and I put the proposition to her that I also mentioned in my introduction, which is, what do you think now about what you said then? And now I offer you Anna Porter.
Right. I think I'm wearing the same pants. Really. When I was listening to the previous speaker, one thing that came to my mind that isn't really related to what I'm going to talk about, but it is kind of tangentially. Many years ago, I had the privilege of working with a Canadian poet called Irving Layton. Some of you may. I hope you do. Anyway, Irving wrote a book called My Brother Jesus, for my brother Jesus, because of course, well, you've heard why. Anyway, it just came to my mind. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to read this because it's too complicated to wing it. In February, 80 graves in a Jewish cemetery in eastern France were sprayed with swastikas. A bagel shop in Paris was defaced with the word Juden, and swastikas were painted onto street art in Paris depicting Simone Weil, a former minister and Auschwitz survivor. In Paris, a Holocaust survivor was murdered in March. She was 85 years old. She was stabbed 11 times and burned. In April, a 65-year-old Jewish woman was beaten and thrown out of a window. Both crimes were, the magistrate said, related to the victim's religion. The French Interior Minister said that anti-Semitism is spreading like poison. The number of anti-Semitic acts in France surged by 74% in 2018. 74%. Some of you may have read that Gilets jaunes marchers were caught on video yelling dirty Zionist shit. Go back to Tel Aviv at Alain Finkielkraut, who happens to be a French philosopher. In December 2017, a synagogue in Gothenburg, Sweden, was firebombed, and in Malmö, Sweden, people were chanting, "We're going to shoot the Jews." April 2019, vandals damaged a Jewish cemetery in Bucharest. This is a city where more than 200,000 Jews were murdered in 1943. Moses mentioned Kastner's train, I think. At least he was pointing to it. When I was writing this book, I traveled all over Europe interviewing Holocaust survivors because the book is about the Holocaust in Hungary. And I thought at the time that those times, the times of persecution, were long gone, that the country where I was born in Hungary, would deal finally with its past, because after all, 1989 opened up the borders and we could now join the rest of Europe. Yet, Regent Miklos Horthy, some of you may never have heard of, and it's okay. You don't want to know about this guy, not too much. He's the guy who was in charge of Hungary. He ruled the country where 450,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered. I don't know if any of you have been to Auschwitz. Right. Auschwitz-Birkenau. Most of the people murdered in those gas chambers were Hungarian. Yet, Viktor Orban, who happens to be the prime minister of the country where I was born, called Miklos Horthy a great statesman a few weeks ago. When I traveled across Eastern Europe in 2009, 2010 to write Ghosts of Europe, I found a tendency to ignore or forget the ghosts of the Holocaust. In Prague, synagogues have been turned into museums, which is, oddly enough, what Hitler had planned for them to be. It was going to be museums of a vanished people. In Poland, some politicians have taken to blaming the Jews for their own genocide, which is quite a trick. Many Poles, Polish national identity is intimately tied to the narrative of Polish victimhood in World War II. Some of you may have heard the phrase, Christ of Nations. Texts written by Jews are cited as evidence to indict Jewish leadership in the Holocaust and the behavior of the Jewish police and the tragic, choiceless choices facing extermination. There's a radio station called Radio Maria in Poland. It has more than 1 million listeners and is openly anti-Semitic. Its founding president is Father Rydzyk, a Roman Catholic priest, a close friend of Mr. Kaczynski, leader of the current ruling party. 75 years after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism is now mainstream again. Germany's Commissioner of Anti-Semitism warned against wearing skull caps in public, given the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany. On Holland's National Day of Liberation, Dutch soccer fans chanted about gassing Jews and assaulted a Jew who asked them to stop. Belgian carnival puppets featuring grinning Jews with money bags were on parade just a few weeks ago. I saw those carved figures of Jews with money bags when I attended the Singer Festival in Warsaw. It's an annual event celebrating Jewish culture, if you believe it, including the money bags and the carved figures, and there are sidewalk hawkers and organ grinders, all dressed in Jewish garb, and there is klezmer hip-hop. What there isn't is Jews. There are no Jews attending the Singer Festival. In October 2018, 11 Jews were murdered in Pittsburgh's Tree of Life synagogue. April 27, a synagogue was attacked in Poway, California. The rabbi and some others were shot. A woman was killed. The violence and demented propaganda is increasing with Facebook and Twitter and other internet sites where hate is rewarded. Accusations that Zionists run America, I'm sure you've heard that one, and or that they are fighting for the return of communism. Or this is the old Judeo-Bolshevism accusation, which is what has infected the image of George Soros in some places. I wrote a book about George Soros. I have to tell you, I did not love him for a number of reasons, but it wasn't because he's a Judeo-Bolshevik, or, which is the other image of George Soros, a globalist, capitalist, cosmopolitan. One of my friends, Jack Rabinovich, used to say, well, if I have a choice, I'd rather do the cosmopolitan capitalist rather than the Bolshevik communist. In Hungary last year,
There were posters of George Soros all over the streets, giant posters indirectly paid for by the European Union. And the wording under these posters of the grinning George Soros were, "Do not let him get the last laugh." The government was fighting for re-election against George Soros. He was not running for anything at all in Hungary, but he happens to be Jewish. I wanted to mention Israel Apartheid Week, which was apparently born in Canada. I did not know that. My friend Irving Abella told me this yesterday. Irving Abella is the author of a book called None is Too Many. Some of you may remember the book. If you don't remember the book, it's been reissued recently. None is too many are the words used by the Prime Minister of Canada at the time in answer to the question, how many Jews should be let in? This is during the time of the Holocaust. Anyway, Israel Apartheid Week has now spread to 40 campuses across Canada and the United States. It's an annual event of protests and rallies and film screenings and lectures and actions designed to promote boycott, divest, and sanctions, or fondly referred to as BDS. The Israeli government and its politicians, who perhaps should be there to listen to this, are out of reach of the student activists, but Jewish students and other campus community members who happen to be Jewish are right there. And boy, do they make a convenient target. As a result, students who are members of a historically oppressed minority are harassed across universities. Israel Apartheid Week is sponsored intimidation. I just wanted to mention that, oddly enough, at Haifa University in Israel, 40% of the students are Arab or Druze. 60% are Jewish. One of the founders of BDS is a man called Omar Barghouti, who lives in Israel. He's a graduate of an Israeli university. And he has declared that he is not in favor of a two-state solution. He doesn't think it would work. He recommends instead euthanasia for Jews. At York University during Israel Apartheid Week, Jewish students were shouted at and shoved, and many of them were afraid to go to school. I was on the board of York University, and I resigned from the board because I felt that the board should have done something, but I was told it was powerless. This was up to the students. Oddly enough, CUPE and the Canadian Union of Postal Workers and Unifor have all decided to support BDS. They have had demonstrations in Canada declaring that Israel is a terrorist state. And I'm mentioning this because in the Middle East there are anti-Jewish TV shows, such as I mentioned earlier, a very successful television series called The Elders of Zion, which ran in Egypt for many weeks. I don't recall any condemnation of this series from the students. I don't recall any condemnation or demonstrations when 250 people were killed at the Miss World contest, when the ancient Buddha was destroyed in Afghanistan, when gays were murdered in Islamic countries, when Iraq murders Kurds. No mention of the 850,000 Jews forced out of Arab lands. No protest against the murder of Russian journalists. It's the most dangerous country in the world to be a journalist in. I haven't seen any protests, really, of the type that BDS is, protesting the incarceration of Uyghurs in China, or the killing of the Rohingya in Myanmar, or the Yazidis. You barely read about them in the newspaper. Amos Oz, a distinguished Israeli writer, wrote something recently. The walls of his grandparents' European house were covered with graffiti saying, "Jews go to Palestine." Now they say, "Jews get out of Palestine." Anti-Semitism is hard to explain. It is irrational, it's delusional, it's absurd. Conspiracy theorists just believe you are part of the conspiracy if you try to argue. For example, I think some of you may have heard the argument or the debate about whether or not Zionist Jews were warned not to go to work when the World Trade Center was destroyed. Yet, you'd think it's absurd. Yet, a French book about this was published and became very, very successful. One of the two organizers of the Women's March in America attended a rally with Pastor Farah Khan, who believes what I've just said about the World Trade Center and the Jews. One of the other women leaders of the Women's March said, "Nothing is creepier than Zionism." You can imagine that Jewish women have trouble joining the Women's March. The Chicago Dyke March ousted Jewish women. Yet, Israel is the only country in the Middle East where you can be openly gay. A private guard or a police officer is stationed outside most European synagogues now, and American synagogues have been warned to use trained, armed volunteers at their entrances. The Charlottesville marchers, amongst other things, were shouting, "Jews will not replace us." I think in some ways Mr. Trump has fueled anti-Semitism, never directly, indirectly. At a Jewish Republican event, for example, he said, "Is there anyone in this audience who doesn't negotiate deals?" The whole of the British Labour Party, it's an arena where it's actually okay to make anti-Semitic remarks. So much so that there's now a movement afoot to expose some of the members and to get them out of the party. Ken Livingstone, a former mayor of London, claimed that Zionists had collaborated with Hitler's Nazis. I mean, what? Some of you may have seen at the end of March, there's an annual hate fest right here in Toronto, El Quds Day, sponsored by Iranians. It targets Jews as well as Israelis. Well, there are not that many Israelis in Toronto. And some of the people attending this rally shout, "Kill the Jews." Demonization? Yes. There were 2,041 anti-Semitic incidents recorded last year in Canada. It's a record high in a third consecutive year, reflecting the new normal. The landscape of anti-Semitism is here: harassment, vandalism, violence. Neutrality on this issue is cowardly. Each of us must stand and be counted. Moses mentioned, my last book is called, in other words, How I Fell in Love with Canada. One book at a time. It tells stories about great Canadian storytellers, poets, some politicians, some business people, extraordinary people. You know what? We're better than this. You'll be at a dinner party and someone will talk about hiring an associate, the law firm, who's a Jew, but not a typical Jew. It's a clueless anti-Semite, but nevertheless an anti-Semite. So what do? Do you spoil the dinner party? Yes. Yes, spoil the party. Words are important. Be careful what words you are willing to countenance. Thank you.